Hi class, this presentation is on modernism in art, and we're going to cover a lot in a relatively short presentation this week because I want you to focus on the next museum paper, which I'll give you directions on in the content folder. So when we talk about modernism, it refers to the period between 1850 and about 1960. But in this presentation, we're going to be discussing the time period till about 1900. After that will be in the upcoming weeks. We're going to begin with the realistic movement. We're going to discuss Impressionism, and we're going to end with the avant-garde. So during the early 1900s, industrialization and urbanization quickly changed the world. And in the second half of the century, this increased economic and political intersection followed. We're going to talk about that in the next few slides. This is known as the Second Industrial Revolution. So the first industrial revolution was focused on textiles, iron, steam, and then the second revolution kind of was a push to steel, electricity, chemical compounds, and oils. So the Western world experienced changes that transformed Europe and the United States from a more traditional society, agriculturally based, into a more modern one, where cities and factories, mass transportation took over. So capitalism, it's the economic system of the modern world. People exchange labor for a fixed wage and use their wages to buy consumer items rather than produce those items themselves. This economic change dramatically affected class relations. It offered opportunities for great wealth through individual incentive, through the industrialization of the world, through technology and the advances of technology. So we're going to be moving into the next presentation all the way up to basically almost the 20th century, 21st century, I mean. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the late 18th century and rapidly swept across Europe. It hit us after the Civil War. It transformed economic and social relationships. It offered cheaper consumer goods. It changed the notions of education. So as industrialization and cities grew, urban culture replaced agrarian culture. Cities were now the sites of new wealth and opportunity, with their factories and manufacturing potential. People moved from small farms to large cities, which also kind of helped to break down traditional culture and values. There were also new complications in cities, such as growing urban crime, prostitution, depersonalization, alienation. People felt alienated from others. They just didn't know each other, like in a small town capacity. In a small town, you knew everybody. You knew the cobbler who made your shoes, etc. In a large city, you get kind of lost. So all these technological advances, railroads, gas lighting, streetcars, factory systems, indoor plumbing, etc., dramatically affected the way people are living now and how they think about themselves. So people in industrialized areas thought of themselves more as progressive and modern. And when they think about undeveloped cultures or even where they came from, more agricultural, and in undeveloped countries, they thought of them as primitive and backwards. So colonization from Western rulers really took hold during this time. They took stake of different parts of the world. So the French had North Africa, and the British had Australia, India, and South Africa. We have the Dutch in the Pacific, etc. So modernity is characterized by more secularism, diminished religious authority. People did not quite completely abandon religion, but they paid less attention to it. Organized religions were less able to dictate standards, values of everyday life for people. Fine art moved from representing human experience and its relationship to God to a focus on personal emotions, individual experiences, etc. Many artists closely identified and embraced the modern world, the techniques, the innovations, invention, discovery, creativity, change. These are key elements of all the artwork that we're going to be looking at. So by the mid 1850s, artists were looking towards the private sector for patronage, for money, for tapping into that growing group of middle class collectors that had money to spend and houses to fill with paintings. The new middle class that was rising made its money through the industrialization, the manufacturing that was going on in the big cities. They had disposable income. They wanted pictures that they could understand, that were easy to look at, that could fit into their homes, showed subjects that they liked. They didn't care so much for historical cycles of gods, saints, heroes. So here we see realism, which developed in France and focused on what was relevant during their time. Artists that created this realistic genre focused on everyday life, not fictional or religious genres. The subject matter was often categorized as mundane and trivial. The working class and the poor were represented like they were never represented before and created on a scale once reserved for religious icons. So as we've seen in the past in this class, right, most of the works were classical themes, also religious Catholicism, right? We had the Virgin Mary, we had Jesus. But here we have Gustave Courbet's um, everyday life here in the Stonebreakers. We see two hardworking men doing the most backbreaking work here, breaking stones, trying to make a basic living here. It's not beautified. It's shown with accuracy. We see the direct action of what they're doing, right? He's using his hammer to break those stones. We don't see their personalities here. We see their faces are turned away or in shadow. The tones here are very simple, right? We have browns and grays. They take up most of the scene. The background doesn't really matter so much, right? We see that dark shadowing back there, kind of a chiaroscuro effect, right? Because we have this darkness on the left and we have this extreme lightness on the right, and this play back and forth. So here we see Jean-Francois Millet, and he focused on country life and their occupations. Here we see three peasant women collecting wheat. These women take up most of the frame here, right? So we're seeing their action. It's showcasing this backbreaking work they're doing. But there is this beautiful element that we didn't see in the work in the previous slide. We see this beautiful landscape behind them, right? We see this bluish sky. But again, we don't see expressions. We don't see their faces. We just see the task of what they're doing. So here we see Honoré Damet, and he paints the urban poor. So we moved from the countryside here to the urban. Here we see people in third class passage of a railroad car. Their faces here, we do see them, but they look vague, expressionless. Expressionless. The look here can be kind of viewed as a snapshot, right? It's not, it looks like more of an underpainting. It's simplified, right? It's a snapshot of what's going on at the time. We see a woman breastfeeding on the left. We see a child sleeping on the right. Again, it's not idealized. It's not romantic by no means. It's dark. It's very simplistic. We see these men in top hats behind, having conversations. Again, we see the light shining in through the windows on the left, creating, like we've talked about throughout this whole class, a chiaroscuro, dark and light effect. Um, Again, muted tones. We have a little bit more color here. We have some greens, but again, mostly a muted palette. So here we see Edouard Manet, and he was a pivotal person in the realism movement, but also he straddled into Impressionism as well. He categorized himself as a realist, but he does bridge both sides. So here we see luncheon on the grass here. So we have identifiable people here, not unidentifiable people like we saw in the previous slides. We saw peasants at work, their faces vague or obscured, that we don't even see their faces, right? We just saw their actions. Here we see people even looking at us. So he chose very specific models during that time, identifiable people. And also his choice of nudes, right, in these everyday settings. Prior to this, nudes were idealized. They were shown as classical figures or gods. Here, this current woman, she's looking at us. She's not shy or flirtatious, but she's just looking at us matter-of-factly, like, all right, I'm just reclining after eating lunch on the grass here. But people thought this scene during the time was vulgar. But if we think about it, what if the scene was of mythological figures, like in Botticelli's Primavera? Would it be more acceptable? Definitely. Interesting, right? So here we see another Manet. This was another scandalous scene during that time frame. It showcased a prostitute and a black maid presenting her flowers. So this theme did not go over well. The public was kind of horrified by this, especially how vague this prostitute's stare was. She's just looking right at us, right? She's kind of inviting the viewer into a scene that they didn't want to be a part of, right? This taboo-ness here. She's definitely emphasized her nude body, right? It's emphasized by a black thin line around her whole form. Impressionism is a 19th century art movement. It was originated by a group of Paris-based artists, including Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, and Marie Cassatt. These artists constructed their pictures with freely brushed colors that took precedence over line and contours. They typically painted scenes of modern life and often painted outdoors. The Impressionists found that they could capture momentary, transient effects of sunlight by painting in plain air. Many Impressionistic paintings and prints, especially those produced by Cassatt, are of interiors. Impressionists captured ordinary subjects engaged in day-to-day activities in both rural and urban settings. Impressionistic artists, they kind of relaxed the boundary between subject and background. The effect of Impressionistic painting often resembles a snapshot, a part of a larger reality, captured maybe by chance. Here's one of Manet's work that demonstrates his interest in loose brush strokes and leisurely social activities of 19th century Parisians. Impressionistic paintings are categorized by their short, thick strokes of paint, which we see here in Sisley's work. It captures the essence of the art rather than the details. Colors are often applied side by side. Very little mixing is done. So you have one color that's a little bit lighter right next to a darker color. So the development of Impressionism can kind of be linked to photography. So photography we're going to talk about in depth in next week's presentation. We're going to talk about its development as an art tool, aiding painters and artists to its own art genre. Here we see Paul Gauguin's still life with flowers, kind of like a snapshot of time of this scene. Um, we see a kid, a child at a piano. We see maybe an instructor above him. But again, we see this impressionism. We have this brushstroke, this very simplistic use of line and color. The Impressionists focused on capturing the movement of life, quick moments captured. The representation of light and its changing qualities were very important. As you can see here in a Claude Monet piece, it's a haystack, but the light, the attention to detail of how the light is brighter in the background and how it changes each color quality and gradation from the foreground to the background. It's beautiful. So here we see a clear exodus from the realistic manner. In Vincent van Gogh's Cafe Terrace at Night, we see this focus on color and form. The stars look more like flowers in the upper right? Um, Shapes are pared down to forms and brush strokes of color. Paul Cézanne takes the use of flat color to another level. He focuses on the representation of specific colors and how closely it is to reality. He cared little for the correct or true forms of nature, but he wanted to capture what his eyes saw. And how it can be represented in paint. Uh, in some of his writings, he stated specifically that the effects of traditional painting created a correct perspective, correct structure, a traditional chiaroscuro, was the opposite of his artwork. He created an optical analysis of what nature provides, a correct use of tones and what his eye is seeing. So Edgar Degas was a French artist famous for his paintings, sculptures, prints, and drawings. He especially identified with the subject of dance. More than half of his work depicts dancers. He is regarded as one of the founders of Impressionism, although he rejected the term and he preferred being called a realist. Edgar Degas' work was controversial, but generally admired for his craftsmanship. Here we see Little Dancer of 14 Years. It's a sculpture. We're looking at a bronze version. His original was done in wax, and it was unique because he had an actual tutu, actual ballet slippers, and human hair that was covered in wax for this sculpture. Some critics hated it, some called it appalling and ugly, and some thought it was youth and energizing. Degas is considered one of the founders of Impressionism. His work crossed many stylistic boundaries, and he knew all of the major artists of the time. His dynamic paintings and sketches of everyday life and activities, and his bold color experiments tie him to the Impressionistic movement as one of the greatest artists.